Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dale Walker, Deputy Editor of ITPro, and welcome to the second Q&A of the day on day 3 of ITPro Live. Continuing the day's theme of security, we now turn our attention to encryption, which serves as the foundation of the modern world's defense against hackers. Yet cutting-edge technology may soon bring dramatic changes to encryption technology and the products built from it. To explore this topic, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Zulfikar Ramzan, who is CTO of RSA, a company which is synonymous with the encryption industry. I'm sure you'll be aware. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So to begin, I think it would be a great place to start with getting a sense of the industry of where we are right now. So you can't really talk about encryption without mentioning RSA. The company's built a legacy in the field since the late 70s, early 80s. Now, I won't ask you to talk about your entire company's history, but if we take, let's say, the last 20 years, how do you think the field of encryption has changed over the last 20 years?
Right. So there's been a lot of effort to really standardize encryption. For example, what we call now the Advanced Encryption Standard was first essentially ratified about 20 years ago, and we're celebrating the 20-year anniversary of it this year. And that was the marking of people realizing that encryption technology was going to be foundational in many of our activities. If you go back again 20 years ago, e-commerce was a nascent concept. Now we rely on e-commerce more than ever, especially given the current global conditions and the global pandemic. And if anything, people don't realize that underneath all that complexity of e-commerce transactions, there are a dizzying array of mathematical operations that are there to ensure the sanctity and safety and security of that transaction. And those are made possible by the work of some brilliant minds from the 70s. And it's really remarkable to see that technology as it was conceived of almost 40 years ago, now more than 40 years ago, and seeing that technology become a mainstream part of everyone's lives to the point that people don't even realize it's there.
Okay, so let's take something specific here. So let's talk about, I guess, perhaps what's most important at the moment is the idea of encryption adapting to new technologies. It's having to evolve alongside some very cutting edge technologies. Like we said that the RSA has its legacy going back to the 70s. Now, in that time, we've had things like AI, quantum computing, the rest of them. It's just coming out with woodwork, presenting new challenges, shall we say, for encryption. Let's take AI, if you don't mind, first. What do you think? Sorry, let me rephrase. So, how do you think AI has affected the encryption industry since its beginning? So we're talking, when it first started to arrive, when we start to get some proof of concepts, up until today, where AI is quite ubiquitous across companies. How do you think encryption has kind of evolved over that time?
Right. So it's interesting with AI is that the field goes back now even longer than sort of public key encryption. So if you look at AI, began in the 50s or so. Cryptography, obviously encryption in general, has been around for thousands of years. People have always been trying to keep messages secret from each other. And AI certainly came along after the invention of encryption as we initially saw it. And the two have had a really interesting history together. So first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that in many ways, AI and machine learning look at the same problem as encryption from a completely different lens. If you think about machine learning for a moment, the goal of machine learning is that if I have some kind of black box that I can't understand, and I get to see what goes in and what goes out, can I build a computer program that can figure out how the black box works? That's the real core essence of what it means to learn, right? How do I understand some unknown process given data about that process? Now, cryptography asks a different question. It says, can you build me a black box so that anybody who gets to see what goes in and what goes out is unable to figure out how the black box works? And so amazingly enough, there is a really tight mathematical relationship between these two fields. Now, having said that, we're seeing a lot of more recent work in trying to make cryptography work on top of machine learning algorithms. So there's been a whole slew of work on an area called homomorphic encryption, which is really about how you can encrypt data, but then subsequently perform computations on the data while it's still encrypted. In other words, can we maintain the privacy and security of the data, but still glean meaningful insights and do meaningful computations on that data and do something meaningful with it at the end. And of course, when you have data, the goal of data is not just to have it sit there and be dormant in some hard drive somewhere. The real goal of data, typically in today's world, especially with AI and machine learning, it's really about being able to glean meaningful insights and answer important questions, whether it's a question about a business process or about a healthcare outcome or what have you. And so I think we are seeing a world now where this convergence is existing. I think it's still very early on, by the way. I don't believe that homomorphic encryption is quite yet ready for widespread prime time. It's still a bit too slow. But I think there's a lot of promise in being able to merge these two elements together.
Okay, so on the subject of the homomorphic encryption, do you think this is driven by a kind of wider societal change in terms of like over the last few years alone, we've seen the idea of data privacy and data protection become ingrained in the psyche of users, of businesses across the industry. Do you think it's a like how much does that play a role in the sort of evolution of these types of technologies?
I think with homomorphic encryption, what's interesting is that the actual idea of homomorphic encryption was first posed decades ago in the 80s, actually, whether at that time it was considered an open problem. Could you actually achieve some form of cryptography that allowed you to perform computations on data while it was still encrypted? And so the ideas have been there for a long time. It wasn't only until about the mid 2000s where a researcher, Craig Gentry, who was actually a very good friend of mine, first came up with a way to achieve homomorphic encryption, at least in theory. In other words, he actually figure out the first mechanism by which you could still do computations on encrypted data. His approach, while it sort of broke the barrier, so to speak, was still extremely slow and not quite ready for practical usage. Since that time, we've seen a lot of effort to make his original ideas, improve them, to make them faster, to maybe even hone them in on certain particular problems, can be optimized for a particular problem and do a better job of tackling it. And so I think what's interesting with this particular area is that we've always had a need to some degree for privacy. But I think in this case, it was a technology that hadn't been ready yet and still continues to be in its working phases. But I'm very confident that I think within about, say, 5 to 7 years, we'll have some really compelling systems that can do homomorphic encryption at scale. I think right now, though, it's really much more focused on specific problem areas. Like, for example, can you do homomorphic encryption specifically for machine learning, or specifically for a problem that involves maybe search or something along those lines? But we'll see that field continue to evolve, and I'm certainly excited about how it evolves. And by the way, I want to make one thing clear: even if we get the technology piece correct in 5 to 7 years or something in that time frame, getting wide-scale adoption of cryptographic technology takes a lot longer because people still need to have trust in those systems. There are a lot of kinks that have to be worked out along the way.
You say that it's early days in this sort of technology. How long do you think it will take, if we factor in the idea of adoption and things like that? How long do you think it will take before we get this type of technology as mainstream? But also, I guess a second sort of partner question to that would be, if we're waiting this long for it to be mainstream adopted more broadly, do you think there'll be more challenges arising as we wait for those technologies to become mainstream? Like especially when we think of things like privacy and data protection.
Yeah, I know that's a great question, and it's a tough question to answer, right? So every time people make these predictions about timeframes, they inevitably are wrong. And now we live in a world where everything's recorded, so I'm sheepish to try to make one. But you know what? I'm going to try to be bold here. So I'll say that within 5 to 7 years, we'll have the makings of reasonably efficient homomorphic encryption. I think it's going to take another decade beyond that before that technology is widespread enough for people to feel confident in it. And that decade, by the way, it's a very aggressive target. If you go back and look at RSA, RSA was invented in the 70s, right, as an algorithm. There were still some basic problems that have to be solved. How do you make it efficient? How do you think about implementing it correctly? Sometimes you get the cryptography piece right on paper, but translating that paper into computer code, there's a lot of subtleties. And then on top of that, being able to think about all the systemic issues, the governance issues, the policy issues that go around those elements. I think it took a good decade and a half to 2 decades before RSA as an algorithm became popular enough and readily accepted by the mainstream. And people even still don't even know what it is. So I think it's going to take some time. So I would say that we have to be cognizant of the fact that it's not just about the underlying algorithm. It's also about the pieces that go around it, how it fits into a broader societal framework and system.
Okay. Well, let's steer towards another. Well, the field of quantum computing is something that's a little bit, at least from our perspective as reporters and journalists, the field of quantum computing can sometimes feel a little bit like you're receiving mixed messages, because we get a lot of the time where we speak to people and they say, well, quantum computing will be the future. It'll be able to solve many different things. We'll be able to apply it to lots of different tasks. And then we have another company who will say, well, actually, no, it's not very good. It's going to take too long to develop. We need to develop other things. I would love to hear your perspective on where you think we are currently with quantum computing, and how much of a role it plays in encryption, and how much it will play in encryption.
Right. So I think with quantum computing, it's a case where we know it can change the future of encryption. I don't think anybody knows when that future is going to start happening, and that's really the big broader issue with quantum. So if you go back and kind of let's even go back a bit historically and see some of the underlying context. So the idea of quantum computing came about, I believe it was in the 80s. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, first proposed the idea of trying to build a computer based on some of the principles of quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And what was interesting is it took a number of years before people realized the potential of that particular type of mechanism for doing computation. And it was kind of in the early 90s, I believe it was 92, 93, when Peter Shor, who was a researcher at Bell Labs, identified a way to take a quantum computer and develop an algorithm for breaking two of the most commonly used public key cryptographic systems. Namely, he showed that if you could build a quantum computer at scale, it could be used to break both the RSA algorithm as well as what we call the Diffie-Hellman key exchange mechanism. And what was remarkable is that paper was all done. It was all theoretical. It was all written on paper. Nobody had built a quantum computer up until that point. He was positing that if you could build one, then it could be used to solve these particular problems. And that certainly set off a lot of curiosity about this industry and this field. We're still, I think, a ways to go in terms of being able to build a scalable quantum computer. These things are notoriously difficult to build, primarily because when you talk about things that are working at the quantum level, I mean, we're talking about very, very subtle physical interactions among things at this remarkably small and minute level. And therefore, to be able to make a system like that successfully scale to even a moderately sized problem, the amount of stability that has to be built into that system is remarkable. You have to have temperature stability and think about all these subtle things. And so I think one of the biggest challenges with quantum computers is, can we build them at scale? We're not even close to that yet. If you just look at the numbers, I mean, we can barely do toy problems right now on a quantum computer. We're not yet going to be able to break something. Even a moderately sized RSA key will continue to hold against a quantum computer as it is today. Now, when you fast forward maybe 20 years from now, at that point, I think the future could look very different. If you can build a quantum computer that's big enough, all of a sudden you start to shake the foundations of modern public key cryptography, and with that, you shape the foundations of electronic commerce and much of what we built our secure infrastructure on. And that, to me, it's certainly a frightening prospect, but I think we're still a ways to go. Now, one last point I want to make is that when it comes to cryptography, the reality is when you put these systems in place, when you implement these algorithms, they often have a lifetime that's much larger than you may have initially imagined. So if I were to say, hey, even if I were to build a quantum computer, tell you that in 20 years, there will be a quantum computer and I can put a timestamp on that date, it may take 15 to 20 years before we can replace all the cryptography we're using today with some equivalent that would work well in the post-quantum world. Just because these things are so widespread, nobody even knows where they are half the time. They've just been running for a long period of time. And so I think there's a lot of effort that's going to go into trying to build a transition plan. And that's why it's important to start this process now. We don't want to wait until quantum computers are built at scale before we start thinking about replacing what we have today. We we want to start planning for that future right now, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't know when that future will arrive.
Okay, that leads me on quite nicely to my second question. I was quite interested in the idea of building security tools in a world of quantum. How do you first off, how do you plan ahead in terms, like, if you know that quantum is coming, if you've got this in the headlights and you can see it coming, how do you future-proof your current tools to make it so that you are taking advantage of the knowledge that you do already know that it's coming, instead of just saying, okay, well, we know it's coming, it'll happen eventually, but we're not quite taking advantage of it now. Like, how do you do that, and when do you start doing that?
Right. So I think the first step, if you're an organization, it's to figure out where are you using cryptography today, and that's not an easy question to answer. Sometimes, I mean, it's probably all over the place. But taking that inventory of where cryptography is being used, what type of cryptography is being used, what it's being used for, that has to be the formal basis of your kind of overall risk management program for dealing with the potential risks and implications of a quantum computer being built. Once you know that information, then the real question becomes, where do you start to phase out existing technology with future, maybe quantum safe technology? And there, I think we have a lot of open questions. I think that the first big open question is, we haven't really agreed upon an algorithm that will work in the post-quantum world. And when I say agree upon, I mean, it really is a process like that, where today many different algorithms are being proposed. They're being analyzed by people who know how to analyze these algorithms, but even this analysis can take a long time. And people are trying to find whether they're confident enough in a new choice to determine whether it is a suitable replacement for what we have today. One thing that's remarkable about our field in cryptography is that we have no real way of knowing whether an algorithm will be secure in the field. We don't know that. Maybe we think we know the best way to break it, and maybe we can make the keys big enough so that we can address that kind of attack. What if somebody comes along tomorrow and finds a more clever way to break the algorithm that we didn't think of? And so in many ways, there's an expression that cryptographers rarely sleep well at night, because we're always worried about somebody waking up tomorrow and finding a better system or better approach to breaking one of our algorithms. And so I think that we are in a world like that, where with quantum computing in particular, we know that quantum computing is going to come eventually. We just don't know how long it's going to take. We don't have a good replacement option at this point for traditional public key cryptography. There's a lot of candidates on the table, but they've got to be analyzed and vetted. We've got to think through all these implications carefully. But I would say that for any organization as a precursor to all that, at the very least, you should have that inventory in place and have a plan in place that, if you were to have to make a change, these are the steps you might want to do. There's one last piece of advice I'll give you, which is that I suspect that if quantum computers are built, it's not like we're going to immediately have a quantum computer that scales infinitely well. And so maybe what they'll be able to do is build a quantum computer that they can break a certain size key of RSA within a reasonable amount of time. If that's the case, just take the key and make it 10 times bigger, and you'll buy yourself maybe a couple of more years of breathing room. And so even thinking about something as simple as, if you had to change the key for the algorithms you use today, how difficult would that be, and what would be the steps that would be involved in doing that? That's the kind of exercise you want to do now so that you're ready for that eventuality.
Okay, so I guess the message is be prepared, but the idea that quantum is, something that you need to, the idea that quantum is happening right now and is affecting your business right now is not necessarily true. It's something that is coming, but it's not something you need to be immediately worried about today.
That's correct. Yeah. So it's the kind of thing that we know it's coming. We just don't know when it's going to happen. But I would say that right now, the best you can do is to plan for it. I mean, take some time, do that inventory. There's no immediate sense of urgency, but it's the kind of situation that if you don't plan for right now, all of a sudden it does become urgent and emergent at the same time. And you don't want to be in that box. It's better to be in the box of knowing it's important and starting to do some of the thinking up front, so you avoid an emergency, complicated situation later on.
Just as a kind of last question on the quantum and AI side, I guess, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what the security vendor market might look like in sort of 10, 20 years. Are we going to see a kind of a shake up of what we currently have? Are there going to be like, the people who can take advantage of the quantum side or the AI side? Is it, how do you see it kind of playing out in that time?
Right. So I think one is we're certainly seeing a lot of really exciting new technology in cryptography that's being developed. Some of that, by the way, is I shouldn't say new. Some of these ideas have been around for decades, but what's new is the ability to get those ideas and make them practical enough and implementable so you can push them out and actually have them work in real world production systems. So I think that we'll see a number of companies come up. Even right now, we're seeing companies come up in this area that take the latest advances in cryptography. Actually, I should say the latest advances from 20 years ago. They're trying to now make them realizable today. So we'll see a lot of effort in that area. We'll see a number of companies. But I think if you look at the broader industry, it's really important to keep in mind that cryptography only forms a small basis, a small piece of the bigger, broader cybersecurity puzzle. And by the way, there's no better case of that than RSA. What's remarkable, and something I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, you talked about cryptography over the last 20 years. What's remarkable is that RSA has made no money over the past 20 years on the technologies that it invented 40 years ago, because those technologies were invented 40 years ago, they were patented, the patents expired, all that intellectual property is not valuable anymore as it was when it first came out. And so RSA, for example, as a company, ended up going into having a much maybe broader and more diversified portfolio of technologies, recognizing that cybersecurity wasn't just about getting encryption correct, but there are other problems like dealing with online fraud or integrated risk management, or secure identity and access management, or being able to monitor digital infrastructure for threats. And to me, any organization that wants to successfully have a good cybersecurity program has to look at a variety of vendors across a variety of disciplines and recognize that different vendors will offer different levels of value and different value propositions in regards to the way you can reduce risk in an intelligent way.
Excuse me. So moving on slightly from AI and quantum. Excuse me. Oh, right. Sorry. Let's try that again. So moving on from AI and quantum for the moment, but we'll likely come back to it. Last October, we ran a story from there was a tech event in London, and the CTO of KPMG, David Fairbash, said that he believed that the cyber war was no longer being won by hackers. And it was a quote that kind of proved to be a little bit divisive across our audience. It's a lot of people said that it was perhaps naive, but it was essentially the idea that because of the way that companies are now working together, the better law enforcement, things like that, it's kind of made it more difficult for a hacker to operate, and that, or essentially that they're kind of losing the war. It's a losing battle now. I would love to get your perspective on this, particularly in the context of encryption, and how you think the last couple of years have played out, and perhaps the next couple of years are going to play out. Is it more difficult now for hackers to break security break encryption, or is it going to become easier with things like quantum will exist for good guys and bad guys?
Right, it's such a very fascinating topic on its own, and I think that the real lesson that we've seen over the past 40 years has been that people don't break cryptography; they find ways to bypass cryptography. Yes, there are people who publish interesting papers and come up with clever mathematical ways of trying to break an algorithm with less time than it would take to do it via brute force. Those types of papers, although they do come out, it's exceedingly rare to see a paper like that actually have a real-world practical attack on a widespread, well-studied algorithm. What does tend to happen more often is that we find implementation errors, or maybe somebody thinks that data is being encrypted, but it's not, or they encrypt the data correctly, but somehow the key is stored in a bad location, or we trick somebody into doing something else, like maybe changing their configuration settings and lowering the strength of the encryption, but not realizing it. So there's a whole slew of ways you could potentially break these systems or compromise the security of the systems without actually breaking cryptography, but finding ways to bypass it at a fundamental level. And so I think, if you are thinking about this problem, at an industry level, it's important to bear that in mind. And that's really why, why I made that earlier point about that whole defense in depth. It's not just about looking at one particular area alone, but having a breadth of capabilities that can be used across the board. Now, I think the statement, whether we are losing the war or winning the war, I guess, as a vendor, I try to always be optimistic. For me, it's really about what can we do in light of the current situation. One thing I'm optimistic about is I am seeing a tremendous amount of collaboration in the industry in things that you wouldn't even know about. Like, for example, at RSA, we have two very large customers who, in fact, are competitors in their worlds. I mean, they are probably the two of them own the vast majority of the market share in their respective vertical. They are household names around the world. And what's remarkable is even though these two companies compete on a regular basis in the external world, their security teams talk to each other every day behind the scenes. They collaborate, they identify threats that might impact one or the other. For example, what typically happens is when somebody targets one of these companies, inevitably that same attack will be used to target the other company as well. And so they're comparing notes. They don't want to compete on their cybersecurity strengths. They want to compete on their overall business strengths and make sure that they stay safe on the cyber front. And there's a really important reason for that. There's a business reason as well, which is that when you have a cyber threat, what effectively you're doing is you're kind of lowering the tide, and that causes all the boats to fall. And what that means is that if somebody compromises one company in a particular industry, that compromise not only hurts that initial company, but it can hurt every company in that industry because people's faith in that industry goes down. People's trust in those organizations decreases. And that hurts everybody across the board. And so I'm very hopeful. I'm seeing a tremendous amount of collaboration going on. Not everybody knows about this collaboration because you often have to be in the industry and know the right people and know who's doing it. But I think that in that vein, we've made tremendous progress. Threat actors are still there. There are still major data breaches that you have to protect against. There are compliance regulations that are looming on the horizon. Some of them have already been implemented and are being enforced. But ultimately, I think, I'm very optimistic about what we can do in our future because the one advantage we have over threat actors is we know our business, we know our organization, we understand our risks. And so I think as a result, we can do a better job of capitalizing on that advantage to provide a reasonably safe and secure posture for all of our digital assets. But that is going to rely upon us leveraging that business-driven view of what's going on out there.
It's a similar sort of. It sounds like a similar sort of paradigm that we saw with the malware inspector work, because I think at the time, I remember I can't remember who it was at Red Hat I was speaking to, but they were saying that perhaps the biggest thing to happen from the malware inspector period was the collaboration that came from it, the companies working together to try and solve something. And I guess I guess it kind of taps into that idea of, this is where we're all facing the same threats, and if one person goes down, it's likely that another one will go down as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that security professionals, we're often very mission driven. It's really about accomplishing a greater mission that helps society. And today, I think about that more than ever in light of what's going on with COVID-19, right? So think about it. COVID-19 has been the greatest accelerant of digital transformation in recent times. We have supplanted many of our physical interactions with digital ones. We are going to digital birthday parties. We're attending digital weddings. We're even mourning the loss of loved ones over digital media. We're working from home. We're streaming movies. We're buying our groceries online. Our reliance on digital technology has never been greater than it is today. But for digital to be successful, for digital transformation to be successful, people need to have trust in those technologies. They have to feel that those technologies are trustworthy. And our industry, the security industry, is really about trying to engender trustworthiness into digital systems. And that is a profoundly important goal because I think, I can't even imagine what the world would be like right now if we didn't have digital capabilities. Imagine what it would be like to deal with a pandemic without the ability to continue working through digital means, without the ability to continue having virtual conferences and whatnot. And so I think that we have an important responsibility to be able to maintain the safety and security and engender that trust in digital systems. And that's a serious mission that everybody in the security industry, or most people in the security industry, really wake up every day and think about as an important part of the mission that they're trying to contribute to the world.
It's an interesting topic that you bring up, the idea of trust in all this, because I think sometimes that sometimes gets lost, because it's, you can particularly with if you don't mind me saying, particularly with security vendors, is that sometimes the idea that their products are just secure enough, and that they people, customers should just take that as face value, that they're secure enough, we've built them as secure as they can be. But sometimes that element of trust is lost, and that can be difficult to gain back once it's lost. So I just wondered how you think the idea of trust is going to, how much of a role trust is going to play as we go forward, particularly at a time when we have some very disruptive technologies coming, and people will be getting mixed messages. They won't be sure which is the best direction to go, particularly if they're investing in things. So yeah, just how you think trust is going to factor into all of this.
Right. I think it's a phenomenal question, because to me, I think trust has always been at the core of the work that we do. And in fact, if you go back to the sort of late 70s, early 80s, when you saw the original papers from Ravesh, Shamir, and Edelman, the R, the S, and the A, papers by Diffie and Hellman and others, they talked about trust in those papers. And the context of it was intriguing, which is that in cybersecurity, we think of trust as a bad thing. And I'll tell you why. If I have to trust a system, that typically means I'm required to trust it, not that I have any reason to trust it. And inevitably, we want to minimize what we have to actually trust, and we want to maximize what we consider trustworthy. And so in that realm, when you look at the work that we've done as cybersecurity professionals, it's really about minimizing that trust surface and maximizing what we consider trustworthy. In that vein, there's been a tremendous amount of work. I mean, if you go back, again, the 70s, the 80s, concepts like least privilege and deperimeterization and others that have been talked about, the way that we've always approached it at RSA, it's really about not just sort of trusting, but having some form of verification on top of that trust. The reality is that systems in the real world are complex. They inevitably will have issues. No system in my mind is impenetrable. Every system at some point will have some weakness or some issue, even if it's the way that system is run by a human operator that can be the issue. And so I think as a result, it's crucial that everything we do is about building out that defense in depth, really thinking about all the different elements that go into protecting real world, large scale systems. And I think that those elements include, number one, thinking about digital identities. That to me is going to be one of the most important topics of the future. Everything is going digital. Our identities are becoming more and more digital. How do we start to control those identities? How do we start to get control of our own data in that world? And thinking about what that means for organizations. And by the way, digital identities, that's been the heart of what's enabled people to take their workforce and allow them to be remote. If you think about what's happened in the last few months, we've got millions and probably billions of people potentially going remote. And I think as a result of that, we've had to master the problem of how we manage digital identities so we can enable people to work remotely and access critical resources. After identity management, it's really about identity governance and lifecycle. How do you know who should access what? How do you manage that access? How do you make sure the right people are assigned the right entitlements? From that problem, you get to the security operations center. How do you start to manage incidents that are going to happen in your organization? How do you get the breadth of visibility across all your key digital assets? And that asset base is growing every day. How do you find out what those assets are doing and whether they're behaving correctly? And then finally, you have the broader notion of integrated risk management. How do I take a look at what's going on across everything I'm doing and get a comprehensive, holistic view of risk? Because ultimately, if you don't know your risks, it's really challenging to operate a business. Every day, CEOs and board members and senior executives have to make critical strategic decisions that advance your business forward. They can't make those decisions without a comprehensive view of the risks that they face. And now cyber risk is becoming one of the biggest facets of digital risk. And digital risk is becoming one of the biggest facets of overall business risk. And so these pieces really tie together. And to me, risk and trust kind of are like yin and yang. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, what we're trying to do ultimately is to minimize or mitigate our risk to get to an acceptable level. At the same time, we're trying to minimize our trust surface and maximize what we consider trustworthy.
Okay. Before we go on to just my final question or two, I just have to ask how has the lockdown affected RSA? Has it and the work that it does? Have you found it challenging? Have you had to adapt like everyone else?
Right. Yeah, we certainly had to adapt. I mean, we were very lucky in that our supply chain team from the early days of when the pandemic was kind of noted, before it was even called a pandemic, we were already planning for what might happen in the future. We started working with some of our suppliers to make sure that we could continue to operate, and more importantly, we could continue to serve our customers. And I'm glad we did that. I mean, we were very lucky at the same time. But what we saw in our business was a surge. A lot of our customers, for example, had to enable a remote workforce. And when I say enable one, they had to do it quickly. Like they would call us on a Friday evening and say, "Hey, can you help us get 3,000 more people to work remotely by Monday morning?" And that's a daunting task. I mean, people have done remote work before, but never at that speed. At the same time, it was a really powerful moment because you get to realize just how pervasive your technologies are, how much your customers rely upon them, how they need to rely upon them more, and then more importantly, that those customers themselves, in many cases, are on the front lines of dealing with COVID-19. Some of them are big hospitals. Some of them are large government organizations. Others are focusing on critical projects that really define what it means to enable and foster human progress. And so if they're not able to do their work successfully, that hurts everybody. And so we felt a tremendous amount of pressure to be there for our customers. And we were very fortunate the team came together, a lot of incredibly hard work by a lot of people to enable many organizations. But I think it's interesting you bring this question up after the trust question. I think that if I had to kind of pinpoint, why is it that we saw this major surge? And I'm not sure others did in the same way, even in our industry. I think it's because we've been around now 40 years. RSA is the longest standing pure play cybersecurity brand on the planet. We were one of the first people talking about doing cybersecurity in the private sector as well as the public sector. And over 40 years, we've engendered trust in the minds of our customers. And so in many ways, when the issues were tough and they were dealing with some thorny, complex problems, I'm glad that they trusted us and that we were trustworthy enough for them. And I think that's something that has to be fostered. I believe in the future, every organization has to invest a tremendous amount in building a trustworthy experience, because today it's not just about a vendor-customer transaction. It's about a vendor-customer partnership, a journey where the vendors and customers work together every step of the way to ensure that the customer is successful in the long run.
Okay, so I've just running out of time a little bit. I'll just ask. Perhaps got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. I think it would be interesting, perhaps, if you could go over any sort of, if you're thinking in the next sort of 10, 20 years, if there are any technologies or any trends that you think should be on a business's radar, things that they should really be looking at, things that they should be consider investing in, or things that they should be wary of.
Yeah, so first of all, the answer is not blockchain, which I think is the classic answer for this type of question. In fact, I think I just want to kind of clarify. I think blockchain has gotten a lot of hype. We haven't really found a good application for it. I think a lot of organizations have been trying to find something. I would suggest investing those intellectual resources elsewhere. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think privacy is going to become a huge issue. There's been a number of technologies in the encryption space around being able to provide a good, favorable trade-off between privacy and civil liberty, and maybe societal benefit from some of that data. So technologies like zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computation. These are technologies that, by the way, have been around for many years. We're finally seeing those technologies get to the forefront. I would say in the broader cybersecurity industry, some areas that we're working on right now, IoT becomes really crucial. I think we're seeing more and more digitally enabled devices. Those devices are connected to the internet, in many cases through a gateway of some sort. Being able to monitor what's happening across all your devices, not only your laptops and desktops and your cloud infrastructure, but also your IoT and edge infrastructure. That's going to be a really crucial area for organizations moving forward, especially in a world where those devices can be used to monitor the health of supply chains. They can be used to monitor what's going on in particular environments. They can really help straddle that line between the cyber and the physical. Those areas are we're finding to be increasingly important, especially in light of the current situation. So I would say that's going to be a huge area. The second area, although I wouldn't say maybe 10 years out, but I think still maybe 3 to 4 in that time frame is what's going to happen when we get through this pandemic eventually, keep our fingers crossed, bringing people back into the office and thinking about what the world's going to look like in the future. And I think this is we're not going to go back to our old way of life. I think that ship has sailed a long time ago. The real question becomes, what does the future look like? And can we start to build and think about the technologies we need? And that's certainly an area that we've been actively involved with, thinking about the future of the Security Operations Center and what that looks like, thinking about the future of identity management and how that looks in the real world, thinking about the future of risk management, and thinking about the future of fraud detection and prevention and response. And those are areas that are all incredibly important to us right now. They're going to continue to be incredibly important in the future because we are relying on digital in a way that we never have in the past. And that means the stakes have never been higher than they are today.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end it on. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Zulfikar, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week of what's left of it. And thank you for everyone who's dialed in from home as well.